What would you say if I were to ask you to tell me about your life? Would you talk about your favorite teacher or the time you moved in 4th grade? Would you gossip about your friends? Would you tell that story about how you scored the winning goal? Although I never scored a winning goal. I did strike out in the bottom of the 9th with the bases loaded. Many times. Would you sing a song? Would you share your deepest fears or talk about your dreams for the future? Would you talk about the politics of the era? Well, all of that is part of your life, part of your history. And all of what happened to all of us is part of our collective history. Yet when we think about history, we usually think it just means memorizing dates and names of important people. Well, I'm a professor of history. I teach about the worst moments in the human experience. I teach about the Holocaust, about genocide, about World War. I often ask my students to think about the most important historical events to have occurred during their lifetime. You can try this too. You're probably coming up with some major political and world events, things like 9/11, various presidential elections. But, trying to stay quiet on that topic. But few of you are probably thinking of the more mundane things that have transformed our lives. Things like the invention of the iPhone or the proliferation of Starbucks. But these impact our lives in important ways as well. We forge intimate friendships over our phones, and we plan our futures over coffee, often at Starbucks. These are important parts of our life, too. Now, don't get me wrong. I certainly think it's important to know names and dates of important people and to know the facts. The facts do matter. And the line, "the facts matter," is not supposed to get applause. Right. Anyway, the names and dates matter, and the decisions that major decision makers in capital cities make profoundly impact our daily lives. With the stroke of a pen, policymakers can make your marriage legal or your residency illegal. So all of this matters. But at the same time, in 20 to 30 years from now, when you're trying to tell your life story to your children, there's a good chance that they're going to be able to name the dates of Donald Trump's presidency, but it's unlikely that they're going to know what a cinnamon dolce frappuccino was. Frankly, I don't. And they're not going to know what it meant to Netflix and chill. But these are parts of our life as well. And in order to understand your life, they need to understand those parts of the world that we live in as well. Well, I started thinking about all of these issues about 15 years ago when I joined an international team of researchers to travel around Eastern Europe and interview Jewish survivors of the Holocaust. Their project was called AHAIM, which is a Yiddish acronym that means homeward, and it stands for the Archives of Historical and Ethnographic Yiddish Memories. And we interviewed hundreds of people. We were most of people who were in their 80s and 90s. We traveled around Eastern Europe, predominantly Ukraine and Moldova, Romania, looking for elderly Jews who could tell us the story of their lives, who could tell us how they survived the Holocaust, but more importantly for our purposes, what life was like before. First, I should say that in Ukraine itself bore a lot of the fighting of the war. About 8 million people were killed in Ukraine during World War II, including about a third of the victims of the Holocaust. The people that we spoke to lost not only their families during the war, but their entire communities, their entire way of life. When they came back to these towns, They found that nobody even spoke their native tongue, Yiddish. Their entire Yiddish-speaking community in Eastern Europe had been eliminated during the war. These people had grown up in Yiddish, they had gone to schools where they learned Yiddish, they'd made friendships in the Yiddish language, and now there was nobody left with whom they could speak. Remember a minute ago when we were talking about trying to explain to your children or grandchildren about Netflix and Frappuccinos, imagine now that even your language is gone and that nobody even speaks your language anymore. That's what it was like for the people that we interviewed. We conducted our interviews in Yiddish, and that helped stimulate memories for them, and I think it made it a bit of a joyous experience for them to be talking in the language of their childhood. We would find our informants really anywhere. We would just go into synagogues or go into community centers or old age homes. Sometimes we would just meet up with people on the street and take out our video camera and start talking to them. Sometimes we would interview people in their homes or in their gardens. Really, what we wanted to do when we introduced ourselves to people was set up a time to interview them in their homes at a comfortable place to set up our cameras. But very often, as soon as we walked into a community center and announced that we were videotaping oral history archives, huge lineups of people formed to come speak with us. People would begin talking and would speak for 45 minutes, an hour, before we could even get out our pens and papers, or later our iPhones, to record their phone numbers. People were so anxious to talk to us. Often, we would walk into a community center to a disheartening scene of elderly people, often poverty-stricken pensioners, sitting at tables in silence. But as soon as we took out our cameras, the whole scene came to life. One of them was a frontline nurse during the war. Another one of them fought the Nazis with the partisans in the forests. Another led a battalion of tanks. Another was a singer in a wedding band. 90-year-olds literally got up to dance. These people wanted to tell us about their heroic moments. They told us about how they fought the Nazis and how they resisted communism. That was important to them. But the vast majority of the time we spent talking to them was about normal things that they missed, about the ordinary things in life that the war had destroyed, and those ordinary things that they still value to this day. You see, when you get into your 80s and 90s, as I learned from these people, it's the ordinary things in life that ultimately matter. People wanted to talk to us about songs. Everyone wanted to sing to us. Some of them belted out show tunes from their youth. Others would kind of snicker as they told us, vulgar schoolyard taunts that they remember from their childhood. A lot of people wanted to pray for us, and they showed us the hymns that they knew from the synagogue or the holiday songs that they would pray. Sometimes we'd be in the middle of a really lighthearted interview, just kind of reminiscing about good times, when suddenly they would remember a song and start singing, and in the middle of the song, they would just break down crying because it reminded them of a painful memory. It's amazing what music can do to stimulate memory. Other times, we'd be having very emotionally difficult interviews as people told us truly disturbing stories about the war or about other parts of their life, and then they would get a twinkle in their eye as a song came to their mind, and they would start singing, and the first smile that we had seen in a 4-hour interview would come across their face. We interviewed Yossel Kogan many times over the years. Yossel told us that he loved music as a child. When he was a prisoner in the Bershad ghetto, he told us that he would take the melodies of popular, optimistic, Soviet patriotic songs, and instead of the lyrics in the original songs, he would write in bitter, ironic lyrics about the desperation of life in the Bershad ghetto. He told us that he hid the notebook, a notebook very much like the one he's holding there. He told us that he hid the notebook in the ghetto because he didn't think he would make it out alive. And he wanted to be sure that if he didn't make it, in generations to come, people would know that in the Bershad ghetto, in the worst of times, Yossel Kogan was still singing songs against Hitler. Well, Yossel survived the war. He survived the roundup by hiding in a chimney and had to stay hidden inside a chimney for several days. He then joined the Red Army and fought all the way to Germany and participated in the Battle of Berlin. He left his signature on the walls of the Reichstag in graffiti as a sign of victory. Other people talked about other aspects of their ordinary lives that they missed from days gone by. A lot of people talked about home remedies, for instance. People told us how you can diagnose diseases by rolling an egg over your body. The person being diagnosed, by the way, is my colleague, Dov Curler, with whom I was conducting the interview. Turned out he just had a cold. People also told us that you could cure all types of ailments or even get financial success, or if you're having trouble conceiving, the answer is to go to the grave of a righteous person and pray by that grave. Other people told us, one woman in particular, told us about a whole bunch of diseases, including the common cold, that you can cure by drinking your own urine. I wouldn't try that one at home. But all of these home cures, I don't think they really believe that they work, but they remind them of a time in the past when this was common medicine, when this was part of their daily life. But nothing really brings people back like food. Psychologists can tell you that food stimulates memories, and I can tell you that memories bring to mind tastes of food as well. People spend hours talking to us about the foods that they used to eat. Our website has a whole section on recipes for gefilte fish. If you don't know, gefilte fish is the minced fish meat served in brine that was a popular dish in Eastern Europe. Whole communities were torn asunder by debates about whether it's best to prepare gefilte fish by using an electric meat grinder or by hacking it by hand on a cutting board. And the people we spoke with got frustrated trying to explain to us the difference between gehackte fish and gefilte fish, in much the same way that you may one day have trouble explaining to your grandchildren the difference between a latte and a macchiato. Food really brings to mind elements of the past. And all of these aspects, food, medicine, songs, it's all about trying to get hold of a world that is no more. Because the world can change very quickly. Historians can tell you that the world can change on a dime. And when it does, it becomes very difficult to remember what memory was once like. We interviewed Itzik and Bella Weissman many times over the years that we were conducting interviews there. They laughed at how unlikely it is that they ended up together. Both of them grew up in the same neighborhood. Bella was from a sophisticated upper-class family, and Itzik was the poorest son of a tailor. But they had a lot in common from their childhood. They remembered the same songs. They remembered the same foods. They remembered stories about Bella's father who played the fiddle in the courtyard and all of the children would follow him along. They had fond memories of those days. But Bella also taught us how quickly that can change. As a prize for having done well in 8th grade, her parents decided to send her on vacation with her grandmother in eastern Ukraine. She left on June 20th, 1941. For those of you who know some names and dates in history, you'll know that June 22nd, 1941 is the day the Germans invaded the Soviet Union, 2 days after Bella was sent on vacation. She wasn't able to get back to her family, but she was able to exchange letters with them. And in those letters, Bella complained that she wanted to come home. She begged to be allowed to come home. And her family wrote her back saying, "Enjoy the extra time you have on vacation. Don't worry about it. We'll be fine." But there was an ominous note to those letters, because at the bottom they said, "But please send us sugar. We desperately need it." In August, 2 months later, the letters stopped. Bella's entire family was killed during the war by the Nazis, along with 18,000 to 20,000 other people in her town. Itzik also survived the war. He survived by being a soldier in the Red Army. But he didn't want to talk about his time as a soldier at all. He was much more interested in talking about what he was fighting for rather than the actual battle. On the other hand, some people just wanted to talk about the war. We met David Foreman in a community center. He was sitting at a table alone, and we went up to him and asked him to tell us about his childhood, to tell us about his schooling. Instead, David told us about how he fought the Nazis at Stalingrad, the major turning point of the war. And then at the end of the interview, his face lit up, and he pulled out of his breast pocket a photo of himself wearing all of his war medals. Now, let me emphasize, David had no idea that there was going to be an international camera crew at the community center that day. He carries that photo around with him, apparently, wherever he goes. It's as though he's been waiting his entire life for somebody to ask him, "Tell me about your life." But in a way, aren't we all? I realized that in reality, I know very little about my own parents' life. This is a photo of my father sitting on his father's lap outside their Budapest apartment in 1944. The photo had been sitting on my father's desk for my whole childhood, and I would pass by it and comment on how ridiculous he looks in those skinny shorts. And he insisted that they were stylish at the time. But it took me a while to realize that both of them are wearing yellow stars over there and there, that they were required to wear as Jews during the war. Well, one time I got back from Ukraine, and I sat my father down, and I asked him about his experiences. And he told me some of the stories that I'd heard many times before. He told me about how he survived, how he escaped a roundup to Auschwitz, about how he survived the war in hiding, and how he escaped communist Hungary to safety in Canada. But he also told me stories that I hadn't heard before. He told me stories about the family lumber business, about their family vacations in Lake Balaton, about his prized stamp collection. All of these stories about parts of his life that really mattered to him. I spoke with my mother as well. She was in Halifax during the war, but she told me about all of the war refugees who would stay in their house as they were coming through. My grandfather was the rabbi of Halifax, and he would help the war refugees find their way, and my grandmother cooked noodle kugel for them. Well, my grandmother died in 1980, and 37 years later, I kid you not, my parents still have a frozen noodle kugel that my grandmother baked before she died 37 years ago. I see it every time I visit my parents and try to get out an ice cream, open the freezer, and there it is, the frozen noodle kugel from 37 years ago. Clearly, it represents more than the noodles and cinnamon and cottage cheese and whatever else you put in the noodle kugel, but it represents something much more profound to my mother, represents a time gone by. Well, I learned a few things from all of these interviews. One, I learned that people are very proud of the good they did even 75 years ago. They're proud of when they stood up for injustice. They're proud of when they spoke up for the oppressed. They're proud of when they stood up for justice and when they stood against oppression. These are things that really mattered to them. But at the same time, they cherish the little things in life that they shared as a community. Things like songs and music and the stories of each other. These are things that they cherish 75 years later as well. So my call to you is to ask your loved ones about their life, to take out your loved ones for a macchiato or a gefilte fish, if you're so inclined, and ask them to tell you about their life. Ask them about their dreams. Ask them about what they cherish. Take out your phone and record it. Do that a whole bunch of times, and then when you get really good at it, put away the phone and just sit down and listen. Thanks.